Well, I got interested in the writing and art stuff early on. In high school, we had a bunch of friends who who I hung out with, who were all the art kids in school, and even at an early age, like 17, 18, art was kind of a central focus. And I don't know how much of that was environment or, kind of natural interests or whatever, but we would stage little group outings. I think when I was about 17, we started renting hotel rooms. We would all get together, and it was kind of this, illicit affair where we'd all, gather in an Embassy Suites hotel room for the night and write poetry. And yeah, it was funny. It was like just a way to kind of kind of a way to get past the grasp of our parents for an evening and have a kind of place of our own. And we would do stuff like that, or we would have parties under bridges in Indiana. It's like there aren't too many places to go. There's not like a culture. You have to kind of make your own space there. We would then take the work from those little get-togethers, and put them in shows at school, or I was the editor of the literary magazine for the high school, so we would include work that we produced there in the magazine. When I was a kid, things like Macintosh computers were just getting started. I remember in my journalism class, we had computers that were completely kind of DOS screens, and you'd have to type in all the commands. And the printers back then were those kind of like dot matrix monsters that would just kind of stream a line across until it eventually produced a letter character on the page. And that's how we would produce the newspaper. We'd do wax rollers and stuff like that. So at that point, technology was just kind of getting evolved enough where it was useful. After high school, after graduation, I ended up going to Savannah College of Art and Design to study photography. One thing about art school that occurred to me pretty quickly was that I wasn't getting the kind of academics I was interested in, and in particular, the kind of literary studies. It caused me to kind of draw back and reevaluate what was going on, and I started reading a lot more when I was in college, because I figured that's what you should do. And I was reading the assigned text, but I was also reading new types of fiction, and at this point, this is kind of the Derrida era, the postmodern theorists, and there was really a kind of a strong aura about that kind of work in academia that I was hearing about, but I wasn't getting exposed to. So anyway, I left Savannah kind of disappointed with what I was getting there, and moved back to Indiana for a few years and freelanced for my local paper, writing articles about other artists in town and the local kind of DIY happening kind of stuff. There were a number of kids who were like running their own little like kind of rave clubs, moved to Chicago and enrolled there as an English lit major. I met my wife by that time, and she was a visual artist. She had done design work for New Art Examiner magazine, and with her we would have all these kind of conversations about artists of the time, and this was just kind of post Guerrilla Girls and various kind of like politically charged art and the whole NEA controversy, this kind of thing. So I was seeing art as a very kind of like active, socially engaged activity, and those kind of conversations and that kind of meeting of perspectives with my wife, who's actually a visual artist. She had no qualms about what she was going to do. She knew the whole time. Led me to kind of say, okay, well, what can we do to kind of be engaged in the culture in a public way? And I think that that kind of decision to get involved publicly was something new for me. So we decided to try opening a used bookstore. I had a huge collection of philosophy books and English lit books. And we found this little space run by a couple who had moved here from Appalachia, and it was just kind of a rundown old building. And so we got a bunch of friends together and built some bookshelves and sold used books, and would have friends come out and play music performances or read poetry or read fiction, and invite put flyers up for it. And this is kind of very under the radar kind of thing, but it gave us an opportunity to really kind of understand how to do things in public. So when we were starting to do this public stuff, and I was really kind of coming to terms philosophically with my multiple interests, we I'm not exactly sure how the time frame broke down, but we quit the bookstore at one point because we wanted to enter publishing and begin to kind of contribute to this marketplace of ideas. And at the same time, I was graduating from Northwestern and looking for other things to do, and New York Examiner was kind of the brightest beacon out there at that point. So I ended up in an internship with them, and there was this kind of very interesting moment where I could suddenly piece together the writing and the visual art in art criticism, and the various kind of interests I had in the market and the art market and in writing and in visual art and all its media, through these kind of like layers of experience I was having. So at the Examiner, I started writing about art, and it allowed me to kind of combine all my interests, and at the same time kind of going to shows, and I think that was the time I first went to Art Chicago, and getting exposed to all the kind of broad range of different types of art that were out there and different approaches to it. And this was also when I was first getting my strongest exposure to Chicago artists and some of the traditions of Chicago art, and the problems associated with making work here. And so and I was able to talk with people who were very experienced, who had a very long view of it. People like Catherine Hickson or Jan Estep at the time, who was, I think she's in Minneapolis now, but they'd been working in Chicago art and in national and international scope for more than a decade, and I can't say how valuable the New York Examiner archives were. Like, I just went through and pulled out magazines from back in the 70s and was reading this kind of fiery rants about the Art Institute, being published by Derek Guthrie, and it was great stuff. At the same time, I'm like picking up all the other magazines that were out at the time, like Dialogue and Art Papers, and so it really kind of opened up this magazine culture. This, when you're in school, there's a kind of book culture, and it binds together a lot of your intellectual influences. When you there's outside of the academy though, and I think there's some resonance there, but I wasn't really as directly exposed to the kind of magazine or ephemeral publishing culture that exists and that drives a lot of the day-to-day operations of the art culture. And so that was a whole new transition. And while I was kind of getting exposed to all this, I was also pulling together the earliest issues of Bridge, which was being published as a journal, because we wanted it to be like a book, something people could save, of course. Oh, and at that time too, Kurt Vonnegut had come out with a new book, and I was luckily landed an interview with him about the book. But it was also a kind of chance for me to put all these questions, both philosophical and artistic, to somebody who's already in the canon, who's still alive. So that interview was very kind of significant for me, and I'm asking him stuff about Hammurabi and the revenge as a philosophical problem, and these are things that he had thought about, which just blew my mind. He could talk about eye for an eye and the Sermon on the Mount and what it means theologically and the philosophical issues connected to that. But it was that was our first issue, and then from there we just kind of kept broadening our scope. And I think, I'm not sure what issue, I think it was 7 or 8. There was one that was a dual issue. It was 2 magazines in one. It was reverse bound, and we came up with a whole role playing game. Essentially a send up of hipsters that you could play any different type of hipster character. Where it kind of reached a kind of system overload, and you couldn't really go much farther than what we'd done with it. And at that point, by then the Examiner had gone under. It had some financial problems, and I think too mission problems. Like it became a kind of creaky, 70s artifact of. That didn't quite fit into some new paradigms that were coming around. So we were really kind of trying to decide what we wanted to do with Bridge, which at that point had developed a kind of subscribership and list of contributors. And we thought, well, this is a void in Chicago. It needs to have a press. People need to get their shows written about. So we decided to try and fill that, and filed for 501c3, which is not for profit. Actually decided to try and make a not-for-profit business out of it, instead of up until that point, which we'd done basically paying out of pocket, and kind of changed the format, made it more of a magazine-style publication. When I was still at the Examiner, looking at spaces over here, West Loop had just kind of been born and was getting some momentum, and Van was looking for a way to kind of relieve some of the burden of his additional rent there, so we bisected the space, and Andrew and Keith set up Bucket Rider Gallery there. And then, so this is kind of gallery history that's associated with that unit in 119, which is very interesting, of collaboration and kind of a multi-use space. And I don't think any of us individually, when we were first starting out, could have afforded to have that space and run it. Mm-hmm. That was the case with NFA, for instance. Like, they just got tired of paying the rent. It was so expensive over there. And so the collaboration was really more a matter of viability. Like, can we help these smaller projects, can we help each other grow and develop? And one of the things that happened out of that whole experience with us was we got into commercial leasing. And commercial leasing is a really good strategy for both making some money to live on and operate on, and helping out your kind of core constituency, like 840 West Washington, where we essentially went in, and there was the space above an auto mechanic shop, and you saw the whole process of us stripping it down, getting up to code, which was insane, because there's all this electrical work and plumbing and just EM lighting, crazy stuff like that. That was another experience. Like, how do you work with a city government to put on an art show or put together an art project? And I think in Chicago there was a real problem with that, because the city government's it maintains a high degree of control over real estate, mm-hmm. and how you can utilize it, and they didn't really leave room for creative projects. I think that a lot of theaters at the time, when we were starting to work on 840, there was a huge uproar about a lot of storefront theaters getting shut down. There were alt spaces that were more like politically invested. I think like the A Zone, I think, ran into this kind of issue. Yeah. They were outside of the kind of visual art as its pure form kind of thing. These people who kind of wanted to do more activisty things, and those spaces were seeing a lot of trouble. They were getting closed down. Hot House got shut down for not having the proper licensing. So there's all this kind of there were all these kind of issues about Chicago's alt spaces, or spaces that people just wanted to develop. Yeah. At the time, we really we weren't focused on that as much. We were actually more focused on, hey, we want to set up an artist studio space. This is what 840 was always about for us in the beginning. Was like, we want to set up this studio space, but how do we do it? How do we finance it? Because all those electricians and plumbers and all those kind of people, they cost a lot of money to hire. So we were trying to figure out ways to finance it, and at the time we just thought, well, let's throw an art fair. We can get money in from some of these other commercial ventures, galleries, and we thought, well, let's have some artists as well, but we'll charge them less for it. And we just put out a call, and we had an application or whatever. And it was astounding to me, because we didn't expect quite that level of reception for it. It was just kind of a blowout. I mean, it was huge to have another art fair. You know what I mean? Like,
it was very controversial in some ways.
It was. At the same time, there were like all these other fairs happening, like Chicago Contemporary and Classic was in town, and Art Chicago was kind of reeling. So people were really wondering about the city's art fair viability, I guess. Right. So it was just a kind of odd timing that we got swept up in, but what happened essentially is that we gained a reputation as an art fair organization, and when we were doing that and trying to finance this artist studio project, we saw the art fair as fitting into the mission, because we could let in galleries that wouldn't get into the other shows, because they didn't have enough money to get in, or their work was maybe too experimental. I mean, the thing about art fairs is, in their purest form, like Basel or, Armory Show or, Art Basel Miami, and at one time Art Chicago, what you would have is this kind of like thoroughly vetted market show. And these were artists who had established a certain market value at auctions and sales to prominent collectors. Well, Art Boat before that, I mean, it didn't fit the kind of Nova, I've been talking about kind of the different, I guess, space issues, and it fits into that, but that was very early on, where Art Chicago was still kind of, its reputation hadn't floundered from an international show to a regional show yet. There was just, that transition had not yet taken place. But the year that we did Art Boat, I think that was beginning to be a whispered thing, like it's not an international art fair anymore. And so how it happened essentially is that we were doing the magazine, and we were talking with galleries who were advertising with us, or who we were writing reviews about, or whatever. And we realized we actually had a pretty good list of very kind of alt space operators, both in Chicago and outside of Chicago, and we were trying to think of a way to get their work seen. This is the problem with alternative projects, is you have there's kind of it's a very academic product. Alternative culture is, alternative spaces are, which is different in some ways from like what people would consider maybe cutting edge spaces, which are a product of like gallery revolts in Paris, in the late 1890s, where you have a kind of system of reception for cutting edge spaces, contemporary spaces. But with alternative spaces, there's no system of reception. It gets to a certain point, and it doesn't go quite through the same matrix that this cutting edge stuff does. And so alternative work doesn't necessarily ever hit that peak in the same way that some of the other contemporary work does. And it's still true. I mean, those artists, I think, because there's kind of anti-commercialism ethic or this kind of stuff, it tries to be subversive, but it does it from outside. And so that some of these artists may later on become famous after they die or things like that. But it's not like there's a kind of way to get into the market and exploit its strengths for the use of the alternative mission. So what we were thinking is, how can we get those spaces up front? We were trying to cook up ideas. At the time, there was this, I can't remember who did this, Drag City or somebody did it. They had put on a rock show aboard a yacht. essentially, I think it sailed the Chicago River. And Marie had been on it, a bunch of my musician friends. It was like kind of the party of that year, and so people remembered it years later and would talk about it. And so we were kind of trying to figure out what to do about it. And this yacht idea kind of cropped up. The boat in and of itself was a real success. I mean, there were things about that experience that are just irreplaceable in terms of the galleries we were working with, the way we set it up, how much fun we had, how tired we got. We did it for 2 years. We could have continued that project, but what we were really drifting toward was this kind of doing something that was more of an art market model. And the alternative spaces is still a big part of what we do. We still have collaboratives and groups that people, individual artists run spaces that wouldn't be shown at Art Chicago, or some of the other mainstream fairs. So we've been talking with people who were involved in the editorial aspect of the magazine about possibly doing a book publishing arm or some kind of, this kind of stuff. But it's not something that you just. I think the big difference is that as we've grown, we've become more deliberate in some ways, and what that means essentially is those other projects are still kind of there, and the idea of them is still there, but we have to recontextualize it within the organization how they best serve the mission. And the mission is still the same. That's the thing, it hasn't really ever changed. So for us, as an art fair, our identity is very, squarely focused on emerging and contemporary. We're in the contemporary area, just like, the Abex painters were part of the modern era. You know what I mean? There's a whole era in art right now that's happening that people just aren't even aware of, that they're living through. So that's the thing, is you really have to educate. I think some artists too don't quite get that disconnect. They don't know that it exists. They just feel like people should, appreciate the work for, the work and the value of it that they put into it. And so you're having to educate a lot of different constituencies, and I think that's organizationally what we can do well. I thought we could do it better through the magazine, but the issue is people have to sit down and read it. The art show, you can kind of immerse somebody in the immediate moments, and they can experience that philosophical perspective or one of themselves. In terms of Bridge overall, from beginning to end, it's this is my project. I'm the founder. This is built around a certain kind of outlook, perspective, philosophy, and I'd like to see certain things happening in the art culture, not just in Chicago, but in the nation and in the world, that I think Bridge can do a lot to help with. And I feel like we're really still quite young.